Good evening. Welcome to whichever One Health event this is. It must be, what is it, 5 or so, 6? I don't know. Somebody should know. So I bet that you guys have heard of One Health before. Is that true? Pretty much. It's okay. So you can blame this on Nicholas. So One Health, this connection between the environment and whether that's biotic environment or whether it's abiotic environment, humans in our societies, animals, plants, all of these things combined interact with each other. And it's kind of my hope. I don't care what major you guys are in, and I know a lot of you are within majors that I'm certainly familiar with, but my hope would be that every major on campus would come to the understanding that no matter what you do, these things interact with what your career goals are. And that whatever you think about your major and what are the important courses, in reality, every course that you take is important for what you're going to be doing in your future. And you're going to wish that you took about a dozen other courses that today you probably are thinking, this really has nothing to do with me. It does. And your careers are really going to tell you that as you get into them. Hopefully you can pick that up early and move on with that. Tonight, we're really, really lucky to have Rachel Hickox here. She came to us through a connection that you guys might remember. Anyone here have a course with Dr. Sunny Babipour? Great, great guy. Unfortunately, Sunny left us, moved to Connecticut to be closer to his family, but he didn't forget us. He didn't forget One Health either, and kind of pointed me towards Rachel. And Rachel has been so helpful in being willing to come down, and her dad helped out with that as well. So that's great that they made it here today, even though in spite of all the snow that we had yesterday, and you guys got some of it today too. But she's here tonight to talk to us about penguins and penguins in peril. So please join me in welcoming her, and you'll have a chance later on for some questions and for you to get a chance to talk to her. She's in her PhD program right now. So again, you're interested in grad school, good time to talk to somebody who's in the midst of it, and maybe she has some insights that you haven't heard from others yet.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really happy to be here. I just wanted to introduce myself before we get started. I did receive my undergraduate degree at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts in 2013. I got this in biology. Then I went on to complete my master's in biology, and specifically in penguins, at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. I was there for a year and a half, and after that I really wanted to get some more experience with fieldwork. So I was able to contact a researcher out in South Africa, and I traveled out in South Africa. I was there on an island for 3 weeks, and then around a local town for another 2 months. And I was there studying penguins, the African penguin actually. And going from that, I then worked at an Mystic Aquarium in Connecticut, working with the African penguins there. And I just got accepted into a PhD program in New Zealand at the University of Otago, so I'll be starting there in about 2 months. And throughout all this, all my experience, I really came to know that penguins, as well as a lot of other animals worldwide, are in peril. And so I was coming here to talk to you tonight about how we can consider conservation from a macroecological point of view, which I'll explain in a little while, and really discuss how we can use a theory and an approach to science in order to look more at conservation of penguins and other species. So first off, what is macroecology? Macroecology is actually it's an analysis. It's a way, it's an approach to look at multi-species patterns and then processes of the biodiversity, specifically distribution and abundance of animals and plants worldwide. Now, when we think of macroecology, it kind of fits in a puzzle with other major scientific fields. Climatology, evolutionary biology, biogeography. All of these kind of come together to form the ecology, environmental sciences that we think of. And all these different pieces kind of pull from the same ideas and the same theories. So they do overlap. But then macroecology is looking at more of the bigger patterns, looking at a global scale. And macroecology has a huge predictive power in order to look at the global scale. So a lot of ecology, a lot of biology will focus looking at from the ground up, looking at species in particular. But macroecology looks globally first. It's a top-down approach. Macroecology is not a theory. It's just a way of analyzing data and species that we have. Okay? So in this approach, this, for example, this is a map of species richness of penguin species across the world. You will notice that they are all south of the equator. There are 18 different species of penguins, and they fall all across the world, from the Galapagos all the way down to Antarctica, New Zealand, South America. And the darker colors, the reds and the oranges, those are where there's a high number of different penguin species, and those are what we call hotspots. So just by mapping all the individual colonies, we can kind of make this map, this hotspot map, to identify where our species are found. So this is like the first, I guess, macroecology step that you'd map something. Then from mapping, you notice, oh, well, South America over there. There's a lot of interesting things going on over there. Let's look at that closer. Then you can zoom in. You can do more analysis of this area. So we'll look closer and we'll say, okay, I wonder what species are living here. This is the Antarctic Peninsula. I wonder what species are there, because we know that there's a high number, 5 actually live down there. Okay? And then going from looking at a specific area, we can then determine all these red dots are different colonies of penguins. So then we can determine, okay, well, this certain colony right here, I wonder about that colony. And we can sort of go down from that top-down approach and look at populations, colonies, and then we can look at the individual. So looking at all of these from that top-down approach leads us to the pattern process debate and 2 stages of macroecology. So in biology, you probably heard over and over and over again, pattern and process. What is the pattern and what is causing, or what's the process by which that pattern occurs? It's the same thing with macroecology. So, for example, certain patterns answer questions as where is a species? When did they occur there? Who are they, and how many are there? So we look at things like species richness, which I showed in the first slide. You can look at range size. How big is a species? Do they just occur on this one island, or are they global? On abundance, how many are there? And then body size, which is a really interesting example, which we'll talk about in a little while. So looking at all these patterns, we kind of want to think, why is this certain species or individual or population where it is? Why are there so many of them, or why are there so few? So looking at those patterns on the global scale, we start to ask questions. And then those questions lead to us looking at the processes. So all of those different patterns are interconnected, and then those patterns will lead to us coming up with processes that explains why these patterns are occurring. So for example, extinction. Why did a certain animal or plant go extinct in this region while others have not? Competition or speciation, predation, even dispersal. So why, for example, are penguins where they are? Why did they not cross over the equator and go north? So all of these questions are huge fundamental questions that we ask in biology, and macroecology is a tool that we can use in order to answer them. Combining patterns and processes, we then think about theory. So, for example, if we're thinking about species richness, the number of species that are in an area, we think about why they're in an area. So think about the environment that they live in. Is it warm? Is it hot? Is it too cold? We can go into further detail and look at the environmental variables that are affecting these different animals or these different species. Or we can even look at the land itself, the environment itself. Macroecology doesn't just have to be about animals. It can be about environmental gradients. They use it large-scale analysis of climate. So any of those large-scale analyses that we're looking at in order to go further and determine theories about why things are accepted is using macroecology. So I really wanted to focus just for a little while on Bergmans Rule. I don't know if you've heard about it before, but Bergmans Rule, it is a theory about body size and latitude. Okay, so Carl Bergman, shown here, created this theory in 1848. He created what he called the Perkins Rule. He observed that globally, body size varies among species in humans. There's different sizes of different individuals. It also depends on species. So if we think about different bird species, right? There are huge birds, ostrich, and then sparrows. Why is there this huge gradient in size? Well, he asked a question. He said, does body size vary predictably as a function of something? Does something cause this? And can we predict it? And he said, yes, we can. So if we think about body temperature, if you think of the two cubes or the two individuals, and you think about mass and body temperature, it's way more efficient for a large animal to be in a cold climate. Think of surface area. A small cube has a smaller surface area than a larger cube. However, the mass is also smaller. So there's less area for that heat to escape. We can see this in gradients of body size as well. So the map is of England on the right, and these are of a type of pigeon. And actually, these birds, even in a small area like the United Kingdom, we can see that smaller birds are found south, more closer to the equator, which in turn equals a warmer climate. So he was able to put body temperature or environmental temperature and connect it with body size. So he made a prediction, which then became Bergmans Rule. And this prediction was that we will see larger body sizes in higher altitudes or latitudes. So we are expanding this prediction. So we're looking countries, we're looking worldwide, we're looking elevation as well in mountains. Is there a difference between altitude, higher altitudes based on temperature? So he hypothesized that because body temperature conservation is much more efficient in larger animals, we would see larger animals in colder climates. Is this a universal rule? Does this apply to all things? Well, as you may guess, success in animals depends on body temperature. If you are not warm enough, you will die. What about endotherms? So endotherms produce their own metabolic heat, but this is expensive. This costs a lot to keep yourself warm. Is there a strategy to conserve such an expensive resource? Is there a way that endotherms conserve their body heat? And yes, they do it based on their body size, one of the ways. So, for example, they have a large surface area to mass, and this ratio then leads them to follow Bergmans Rule. And we see this in many, many, many mammals and birds primarily. Now, of course, there are the exceptions. Everything in biology has an exception. But for the most part, endotherms do follow Bergmans Rule. But then I asked, what about ectotherms? And this is where it gets really tricky. So ectotherms, their body temperature depends on their environment. So they will sit outside all day long, basking in the sun, in order to make sure that their body temperature is warm enough for them to survive and to perform metabolic processes. So their larger body size means that they have to spend more time in the sun in order to warm up. This kind of goes against what Bergman is saying. So there's higher ecological and reproductive compromises that they have to make because they have to spend more time in the sun, which means they have less time for things like reproduction or feeding. So actually, for ectotherms, heat gain is actually more important than conserving their heat. There's nothing to conserve if they don't get warm enough. So they have to be warm in order to even think about conservation of heat, so their gain is much more important to them. So actually, for ectotherms, for the majority of ectotherms, a smaller body size is much more efficient in cold temperatures, which goes completely against what he said. So, not that it doesn't follow Bergmans Rule, it really hates Bergmans Rule, it doesn't follow it at all, but there are species that do. So again, there's exceptions. So there was been many, many studies looking at Bergmans Rule and how it applies to different species worldwide. And actually, there's been studies, one of my professors at the University of Lincoln was doing extensive research on Bergmans Rule, looking at a type of lizard down in South America, Leolamus. Those are on the left-hand screen, and actually they don't follow Bergmans Rule at all. They are similar to the ectotherm paradox that a environmental temperature, a smaller or a colder environmental temperature will mean smaller body size. But there has been investigations in tortoises that show that it does follow Bergmans Rule. But in general, we can conclude that it's suggested that while Bergmans Rule is a valid model in macroecology, it's really only used for endotherms. However, that doesn't make that it's false. It makes it another tool that we can use to look at different species and examine how we can further determine what species follow Bergmans Rule and if there's a better rule out there. We're always trying to make different models that kind of expand and include more species. What are some other applications of things like Bergmans Rule or macroecological modeling? There are many, many, many things that we use in macroecology modeling. You will notice through most of my presentation, we are talking about maps. We make lots and lots of maps. But these maps are layered. So I really like this picture, and I just wanted to explain it before I go on. All of these different layers that you're seeing, they all are different amounts of data, different types of data that we're talking about. So on the top, that blue, you could think of that as just an individual population study. So someone went out, counted a bunch of penguins, and put them on a map. But then if we look at the orange in the middle, right here, we can think of that as maybe elevation, some sort of environmental variable that we're considering. And as we get down, we're talking about things like land formation, mountains, anything like that. And macroecology is really putting all of these layers, sometimes they're called rasters, putting them all together into one big, huge database and looking at why things are where they are, why this occurs, and why is this occurring. So, for example, amphibian richness. This map shows the number of species in an area of amphibians. Amphibians are one of the fastest declining animals in the world. We can look and think that in certain areas, we see that there are huge numbers of amphibians. And this is across the equator. We can use macroecology approaches, including mapping of this kind, and we can see that there are less up in the extremes, in the poles. So just by looking at this, we can further determine why. So we're looking at the distribution, the abundance, and the species richness of individuals worldwide. Bird clutch size. Is there a difference in how many eggs a bird lays depending on where they're located? Interestingly, there's a pattern. In the poles, or up in the northern part, not necessarily down south, but in the northern part, we see that they actually have pretty large clutch sizes. So they can have about 4 eggs in a clutch, which is even more interesting compared to the equator, which is usually known to be a more fertile and more productive environment. They actually have smaller clutch sizes. So by looking at the different clutch sizes across species and space, we can look at reasons why this is occurring. We can look at threats. We can look at wildfires. We can look at disease. Where and when is the next outbreak of the bird flu going to occur? Or is there a new type of flu that's going to come out that we're not expecting, and where is it going to occur? Disasters, the hurricane models, all those projections that you see on the weather, even the storm projections that we saw a couple days ago, those are all using macroecology theory and macroecology approaches in order to predict what's going to happen in a few days. But we can look at this worldwide and definitely in the future as well. So this is a pretty interesting map of fire counts. So these are the number of wildfires over 10 years across the world. We can see huge bands of wildfires, right? I thought it was pretty interesting to see that there are a lot more that occur in the United States than we hear about. And we can look at species extinction and dispersal. So this is plant extinction for 50 years. So we're looking at, there are 3 different panels, and these different panels show you over time what's going to happen. So there's, in the left panel, it's the number present in the year 2000. So this is the number of species that we had in 2000 of plants in Europe. The middle panel shows the number disappearing. So this shows the number of different plant species that are disappearing by 2050. And then it shows in comparison how many are actually appearing. So we do have a lot of new plants that are appearing in the next 50 years. But what does this mean in terms of the species that are already there? Are they the same species? Are they similar species? What's coming and what's going? We can use this to make conservation models of which areas, which plant species we need to focus on in order to protect them. This is also a very interesting projection. This was from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they have big meetings, global meetings, every couple of years, every 7 years. And this was in 2007. And these meetings, they pretty much sit down with all the climatologists, all the stakeholders who are instrumental in determining where our next involvement is going to be in preventing climate change. And they made this projection. So in 2030, this is what our planet is going to look like in terms of warming up. So the purple is actually, that's kind of where we are today. So in 10 years, we will see that we will have gained about 1 degree Celsius. This is what it looks like in 2050, 2070, and this is 2090. And this is what they're expecting from you looking at all of the data worldwide. So taking information from website databases that they've gotten, studies that they've gotten, different scientists, books, museums, every single type of data that they could. They compiled it together and made this projection. It's pretty alarming considering that the majority of the world is in that 5, 6, 7 degree increase range. And then one that's very interesting to me is biodiversity. This is a map, Myers 2000. He created this map looking at hotspots for conservation priorities. These are areas where there are a significant number of species, and these significant number of species contribute to biodiversity worldwide. And these are areas that he says would benefit from conservation. Looking at these, you can kind of think of why they would be there. So this is the Andes. This is New Zealand. There are huge amounts of different species that are going extinct and will never be able to return, bird species and the like. There are huge swaths in Africa. Even in Mexico and in California, we're seeing that these are biodiversity hotspots. So they have a large number of different species, a large number of very valuable species, and those species might not be here much longer. And looking at this map, I really asked questions while I was starting my research and thinking about, well, how does this relate to me? And then how does this relate to penguins in particular, which were my study focus? So I really, to be honest with you, when I started my master's, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to study penguins, but I didn't know in what form. And I was really interested in looking at a more local scale. So going to a colony, counting penguins, looking at individuals. But over time, as I was looking and kind of talking to my supervisor about different projects that I could work on, he was working on the Leolamus study, the lizard study, and he is a macroecologist. And he said, well, what do we know about penguins worldwide? And I said, I don't know. So I went and researched. And I came back and, well, we do know a lot. There are a lot of things that we don't know. And penguin species, they're changing very rapidly. They're a very fluid species, and they're enigmatic, so everyone loves penguins. And if you don't, come talk to me afterwards, I want to know why. So I wanted to look at a practical application of macroecology, and I wanted to know what this practical application, what I could use it for penguins. So in just starting out my study, I really wanted to know, first of all, what is going on worldwide and why is biodiversity declining at such a rapid rate? These are due mainly to things like anthropogenic and environmental threats, so habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, climate change, which I just mentioned. For penguins in particular, it's overfishing and warming oceans. So there are a huge number of factors which contribute to global decline of all biodiversity. And the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is a worldwide organization focused on conservation, they came up with a category system for threatened species. I'm sure you all know what this category system is. It goes from extinct to least concern and threatened and all the different categories in between. All of these different categories are then placed on certain species to kind of tell us, are they capable of going extinct? Will they go extinct soon? Do we have to be worried, essentially? And interestingly, right now, there are 1.8 million identified species of plants, of animals across the globe. 18,788 of those, out of the 52,017 species that the IUCN assessed, are actually threatened. So the IUCN has not been able to assess all 1.8 million species. However, of those that they have, about 20,000 are actually in the threatened category. So either critically endangered, or vulnerable. Vertebrates as a whole have declined by more than 50% just in the past 40 years. And this is just vertebrates. Invertebrates, while we don't put huge emphasis on them, like panda bears and tigers and penguins even, they're going extinct faster. There are much more of them, so that means there's more that could go extinct. So this really put it in perspective, because yeah, I can throw numbers at you, but it doesn't really make sense unless you put it in perspective. So 100 billion different species on Earth, that's what we're kind of thinking. That's what we're expecting. Okay? So out of those species, if there's an extinction rate of just 0.01% a year, so that's minuscule, right? Not even a percent, it's 0.01%. That means that at least 10,000 species are going extinct every year. And I bet most of those 10,000 species we don't even know exist yet, because we are expecting that there are millions and millions of different species that we have yet to even discover. So there are species out there that are going extinct before we even know that they exist. The IUCN also made a way that we could contribute to their conservation. So yes, they're going extinct, but how can we protect them? And one of those ways is to designate protected areas. The IUCN says that a protected area is a clearly defined geographical space which is recognized, dedicated, and managed to achieve long-term conservation goals of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So it has to be worthwhile to protect. It has to have some cultural value to us. It has to provide something in ecosystem services. It has to be a good area for long-term conservation. And we have to dedicate this area and manage this area based on some criteria. This made me think, well, how are these areas actually implemented? How are they chosen? And what species do they protect? Particularly, do they protect penguins? I delved in a little bit deeper and I came up with the IUCN categories. And these are categories that the IUCN has designated. And you can look at any of the protected areas globally and they will tell you exactly what type of protected area they are. So we have everything from strict nature reserves, which no one can go there unless you have a permit and you're doing scientific research. National monuments are also considered protected areas. But then you have managed resource protected areas. So you can go and fish and hunt as long as it's sustainable. There are all different types of categories mixed in here, and every different type of protected area is put into one of these categories. But like I mentioned before, how effective are these protected areas in representing species, population, and ecosystem biodiversity? Do they work? We can talk about things going extinct, plants, animals, individuals, but the conservation efforts that we're putting into place, protected areas, marine protected areas, do they actually work? Or are we just fooling ourselves and making us think that we're actually doing something to help the environment, but it's not working? So again, it brought me back to penguins. I was able to make the global distribution of penguins. So I took data from very, very many different sources, individuals, scientific studies, databases, and I was able to make a global distribution map of penguins. And I was really interested to know, because we always say that penguins are protected and that we should protect them, but I really wanted to know, do the IUCN protected areas, do we actually use those to protect penguins? Do we use something else to protect them? Are they sufficiently protected by protected areas? And is that protection related to something, or is it related to nothing at all? So is there a process behind which protection is determined? Does range size, population size, or conservation status determine if they're protected by a protected area? For instance, is the endangered Galapagos penguin more protected than the widely found and least concerned little penguin? Is there a difference? And then I really was thinking more and more about these different conservation strategies, including range size and population size and conservation status. And was there a way to determine how much they actually should be protected in order to make it work? Is there a way that we can predict how much they should be protected based on things like population size or range size? So I'm just going to go in a little bit further detail into my master's research. First, like I mentioned, I mapped the terrestrial colonies. So I had to think, as you know, penguins are both terrestrial and marine, and I needed to determine whether I was going to look at both of those areas, if I was going to look just terrestrially, or if I was going to look more in depth at marine. Being realistic, I only had about a year to complete my master's, and looking at the data that was out there at that time, what I could use, who I could talk to get the data, I decided that looking at terrestrial colonies would be the best approach. So right now, there's a huge lack of data for penguins in their marine areas. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but penguins move in the water. So this is a huge part of macroecology that hinders a lot of analysis. Animals move, they don't stay still. They migrate, they disperse, they fly, they swim. All these things contribute to how you're going to go about looking at a macroecology study. And actually, there isn't very much data about penguin marine distribution because it is changing so rapidly, and it's very hard to determine where they're going in the water. So we have a general idea, and hopefully for my PhD, I will look more into the marine side. But for my master's, I focus on terrestrial areas. The GBIF and OBIS are databases that combine all, or a vast majority of location and colony data for penguins and for a whole bunch of different species as well. So if you're doing research studies, I encourage you to go on these websites. They're incredible. And then I also use protected areas, so I map protected areas as well. Then I calculated protected area coverage for each species. So I wanted to know how much of the penguin's range was covered by a protected area. I used this by looking at percent of IUCN, which are the protected areas, other, and total protected areas. And I'll explain just in a little while what those mean. But through these two methodologies, I used programs like ArcGIS, QGIS, SCAM. They're modeling software and mapping software. And using all of these, I was able to make a variety of maps. And from there, I was then able to do regression modeling, statistical analysis, and then I was also able to calculate my target model. My target model used population and range size to determine what best protection penguins need, how much they need to be successful. So this is first my protected area global distribution map. It looks very confusing, but the different colors tell you about different protected areas. So the red are IUCN protected areas. So those are designated by the IUCN. I decided to kind of combine them all, so I disregarded the categories and just grouped them as IUCN. The categories for my study were not as important as looking at the protected areas as a whole. Then I considered other protected areas. So there are things like World Heritage Sites. There are national heritage sites, national sites that are determined protected, and those still are protected in that they're conserved in some way. And I wanted to know if there was a difference in those protections. So those are in blue. And then Antarctica. It's a very hot debate, and it's in flux all the time. But that darker blue square down here, this is below the 59th latitude line, and this is what I call the Antarctic protected area. That's covered by the Antarctic Treaty. Now, this treaty declares that this area is protected against certain activities. However, you can imagine looking at that area, it's huge. There are many different countries that are involved in this treaty, and things don't go quite to plan. So the Antarctic Treaty protected area isn't a typical protected area, and there are 4 species in that area that are considered almost completely protected because they are in the Antarctic Treaty area. However, that treaty does not live up to the standards as something like an IUCN protected area, and that's management. And I'll talk about that a bit towards the end of my presentation. So taking this map and looking at all these different protected areas, all these different colors, I then overlaid it and looked at penguin distribution and species richness. All these different dots are different penguin colonies that I went through and determined if they were actually penguin colonies or not, if they were just a sighting of one individual penguin or if they were a colony. I then made sure that they were all on land, so I didn't want to have some colonies that were in the water that would change my colonies that are in the water, that would change my results. So these are all terrestrial areas. And I could have listed all 18 species in all different colors and tell you what's what, but I thought that might be overload. So I just wanted to show you this is the general distribution of penguins worldwide. So using this map, I was able to then create my species richness map, which I showed you before. And this is looking at how many species are in a certain grid spot. And that grid spot is a certain area, and it's consistent. So you pretty much overlay a big piece of graph paper almost over your whole world. And then you're determining how many species are in that square in order to determine the species richness. So there are areas that have huge species richness. South America, the Antarctic Peninsula. There are 3 different species living over here in Australia. New Zealand, there are 5 living in New Zealand. So looking at all of these different species richness and taking that into account, I was then able to map and graph their percent protection. So overlaying all those different layers that I showed it before, I was able to look at their protection. So on the x-axis is all the penguin species. I grouped them to make it easier to read, so these are based on their status, so least concern to endangered. All of these areas are a red and a blue. That's a different species, and there are 18 up here. So I wanted to show the difference between IUCN and other, and the total protection that these species get. And you will see that there's overlap. So for example, this one right here, if we look at this one, this is a vulnerable species of penguins. Now if we look, IUCN and other, if you think about putting them on top of each other, that would be greater than this green line, which shows the total percentage. However, there is overlap, and there's a great amount of overlap between protected areas, which I also needed to take into consideration. So, for example, there is an area that can be IUCN and also a World Heritage protected area. What do you consider it as? Is it IUCN? Is it both? Is it World Heritage? What is it? So, I didn't want to decide. It's not part of my job is to decide what it is. So I wanted to consider them both. So it's doubly protected in that sense. But actually, if you take out that overlap, this green line is how much they are protected total. And it changes. And you will know that there are some species of penguins that are 100% or almost 100% protected. Like I mentioned before, the Antarctic protected area, the Antarctic Treaty assists in that. The Galapagos Islands, those are protected. We have a very vulnerable species of penguins in the Galapagos, the Galapagos penguins. And actually, they're considered 100% protected because they're protected by the Galapagos and the Ecuadorian government. There are some species that are barely protected by the IUCN. Right? But they're hugely protected by other protected areas. And by looking at this, I really drew some very interesting conclusions, and it raised a lot more questions than I could answer, actually. And it was very interesting to me, just looking quickly at the colors. There's a lot more red for endangered species. IUCN covers very many more endangered species. So this brings me to my next analysis, and I wanted to know if things like range size, population size, and conservation status determine how much a penguin species is protected. So doing regression analysis and other statistical tests, I was able to determine that actually range size is the only significant variable that determines if a species is protected or not. So that means if a penguin has a huge area, it is less protected than a penguin species with a smaller area. You can also think of population size. So you would think that species with a small population size would be more protected. That wasn't the case. There wasn't a significant difference between large and small population. And the same with conservation status. While there's a difference, which we saw in the previous slide, there wasn't a significant difference. That really surprised me. I really thought there would be more of a difference in whether a penguin species is protected based on their population size specifically or their conservation status. It's much easier to say that penguin is endangered, let's go protect it using protected areas, and saying, oh, their range is so-and-so kilometers wide, it's huge, we should go protect it. So that surprised me. So I looked in this a little bit further, and I was more interested in the conservation status of those penguins and knowing if range size or population size really did make a difference in conservation status. So was a penguin species determined to be endangered or a least concerned species if their population or range size was small? Actually, population size, again, was not significant. Range size was. So if we look at this graph on the left, it shows that vulnerable and endangered species, specifically endangered species, have smaller range sizes. Smaller population sizes. So endangered species who have very small populations are considered endangered. However, those with very large population sizes are considered least concern. So for individuals, populations such as the little blue penguin, they have millions of different individuals, and they're considered a least concerned species. Adelie penguins in the Antarctic, chinstrap penguins, those are all considered least concerned individuals. However, for range size, it's a little bit different. So vulnerable and endangered species both have very, very small range sizes. So these were significant in that the difference between least concerned near threatened species and their range size compared to vulnerable and endangered species range sizes were vastly different. So that means that we tend to look at penguins and their range size and say, okay, they have very, very small range sizes, let's protect them. So looking at all the data that I had, I really wanted to know, again, if there was a way that we could predict how much we needed to protect a penguin species in order to make sure that we're conserving it to the best of our ability. Now, don't get me wrong. If I could say we need to protect every single colony, every single penguin species that is out there to 100%, I would say perfect, that's what we're going to do. But realistically, we can't do that, unfortunately. If you come up with a way, let me know. So we were looking at a different way to go about this, and this is where I wanted to make a target model. So I used a variety of different techniques. The main technique was using residuals, so comparing population and range size and coming up with a combined number, essentially, and looking at how we can make a total protection percent based on those residuals. So I did general linear modeling, looking at the different data for this, and I took the species that were 100% protected versus the ones that were barely protected. I looked at their range population residual numbers, that combined number, and I kind of extrapolated in between to make this model. So here you'll see 100%, this is what the total protection should be, based on a species range and population. So you can essentially say, okay, this penguin species has a population range residual of 50 or whatever, and you could tell exactly how much it should be protected if you just plot on that graph. So I plotted all of the different species, looked at where they were among this line, and I wanted to know the difference between my theory, my projected level of protection, versus the actual protection that they're getting. And this is what this graph is on the right. So I was looking at the conservation status. It was an easy way for me to look at protection. The green shows total, so that is what currently they're protected at. So least concerned species are protected about 60% of their range, or their population. Endangered species is about 75. So looking at that, and I wanted to see, well, are we meeting my target? Are we getting anywhere close where I think we should be? Yes and no. So least concern, we are quote unquote overprotecting. So we're doing a pretty good job in terms of how much we're protecting. Don't get me wrong, like I said, there's no way to overprotect a species. But according to looking at population and range size, we're doing a really good job protecting those least concerned species. However, when it comes to endangered species, we're doing a pretty poor job. So in theory, based on the endangered species, if you remember what I said about endangered species are more likely to have a smaller range size and a smaller population size. That's how we define an endangered species. That's how they choose endangered species, essentially. So that makes sense that we would want them to be 100% protected if they could. However, they're definitely not. The same with vulnerable. So on the left, the least concerned and the near threatened, their total is greater than my target. But for the more vulnerable and endangered species, the target is not quite there. So I put this on the graph. I just wanted to show you visually another representation of where we are. So the target model for each species is the X. So if you are looking, I just wanted to show you some of the extremes. So for example, this vulnerable species of penguins, the total is right here around 60%. Well, actually, based on their population and range size, they should be 100% protected. Most of the endangered species should all be 100%. There are some species that I did find that overlap, so their target was equal to their total, which was amazing. So I just kind of was able to look at how we can combine different data that we have and determine whether we're conserving appropriately. So to answer my questions that I had, are penguins sufficiently protected by protected areas? 61.27% of total penguin range is currently protected. However, only 19% of that is IUCN protected. So that 61% includes the Antarctic Treaty, and that includes other protected areas. So actually, only 19% are IUCN protected. And that overlap exists, which is where that 61% comes in. Like I mentioned many times, IUCN is much better at protecting vulnerable and endangered species. However, they still do not live up to the target value that I've projected. Are penguins sufficiently protected by protected areas? So their protection is significantly related to range size. However, it's not to population size or conservation status. So again, how are they coming up with where they're designated as protected areas? 10 out of 18 species are underprotected based on the target. And the target model prioritizes more threatened species. How effective are protected areas at representing population and ecosystem biodiversity? Well, the IUCN is based on management strategies. Things like, how are we going to prevent overfishing in this area? How are we going to limit the resource use? So they're looking at management strategies, not necessarily the species that live there. They're also looking at biological, social, ethical, economical factors, considering which in the scope of my project, I was not able to look at all of those factors in the protected areas that cover penguins. Now, protected areas, while they are very good in the sense that they do put limitations on these areas, one of the big problems with them is that there's inconsistent and unregulated management. So it's very easy to go out to an area and say, okay, this cannot happen, this won't happen, this can only happen half the time. Well, who's there managing it? Who's watching over those areas, enforcing those rules? Someone can't be in every area all the time. And not all areas and species are considered or prioritized for protection. So there's always that unfocused protection for all species, not just penguins. So, of course, in science, answering questions leads you to asking a whole bunch more. The two major ones that I am really interested in kind of looking more into is, do we prioritize sites or species for conservation? So do we look at an area and suggest that this area, because of X and Y, looking at these different areas, this is a good place for conservation? Or do we look at, okay, well, this area has this endangered species of kiwi, why don't we protect that area? What do we choose? Can we choose both? And do we implement protected areas to prevent future biodiversity loss or to repair loss that's already occurred? These two questions are hugely debated right now in all fields of conservation. And it was very relevant in terms of penguin conservation because there are species of penguins that are projected to go extinct if we don't do anything. They're okay right now, but they're projected in the next couple of years to not be okay. Do we prioritize those species right now and say, okay, we need to make sure that these are going to persist? They have the ability to persist. Do we prioritize those? And say, well, too bad for all the other species that are going extinct right now. There's a species called the yellow-eyed penguin species, which I will be studying in a few months. They are right here. This yellow-eyed species, there's only about 3,000 left in the wild right now. They're only found in New Zealand. They have a small population, small range size. They're almost extinct already. Do we protect those and try and repair the loss of those species, of those individuals? Do we try and bolster their population? Do we try and get them so that they're at a level so that they can sustain themselves? Do we put all of those resources into protecting these to make sure that they persist rather than protecting a species that has some time that we could work with? There's no right answer to these questions. Every species is going to be different. Every animal is going to be different. Every area, every colony is going to be different. And it is those fundamental questions that we really need to be addressing, which hopefully all of you will be able to address, looking at even any type of plant species, animal species, just looking at where we're focusing our energy. What makes the most sense? So macroecology, I just wanted to bring it all back, just to kind of remind you guys about macroecology and what it's used for. So remember, it's not a theory. There's no theory of macroecology. It's a practice. It's a way. It's an approach to answering ecological questions. And macroecology is used to investigate distributions of ecological features. So species, individuals, populations, plants, animals, environmental factors, weather patterns. It stems from patterns, but it always needs those mechanisms enabled to determine why and where this is happening. And remember that there are always limitations. There are limitations to where you're getting your data from. There are limitations to the type of data that you're using. There's always going to be limitations. There's limitations to software. Maybe there's a certain software out there that doesn't do what you want it to do. However, macroecology is one of those fields of research that is growing, especially with the conservation field. And we're looking at it towards a future of planning. So how do we use macroecology to not only help penguins, but also help the native squirrels in Connecticut or in Pennsylvania? How do we help those? Okay, so I hope that this gave you another tool that you can use in your undergraduate studies. I just wanted to thank you guys for allowing me to come and speak with you today. Thank you, Reg, for allowing me to come and speak, and Sunny, as you mentioned before. Again, if you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to ask me, come up to me afterwards. I'd be happy to answer them, and I hope you have a great evening.
So questions?
Hi, thank you for coming. Um, so, when you're doing studies like these, especially with conservation, how do you draw a line between, I don't know if you can answer this, but how can you draw a line between like natural decline in populations and then like man-made decline?
Sure, that is a really good question, and that is continually going to be a problem in any study that you're doing. In terms of looking globally, there's not going to be a variation that is great enough, a natural variation that is great enough to offset any data. So if you look at your data, you will always be performing statistical analysis to account for those variations. So you'll always be looking at whether the difference in a population size or a range size is based on just, background, if it's just an environmental phenomenon, or if it is determined of something else. So you're always comparing at least one or more than one variable to something else. And that accounts for a lot of the difference. I haven't come across it directly yet with penguins. However, I know that that is a huge struggle right now, especially as we talk about climate change and whether there's what the man-made part of climate change is and how much we're contributing. And actually, most of it, or all of it, is due to us. It's depending on the time and the speed. So it depends on what data you're looking at. It depends on how you're analyzing it and what tools you're using to analyze it. But definitely when you're looking statistically at any of your data, which you should be doing anyway, you want to make sure that you're accounting for that variability. So there is no straight one answer, and it does depend on what you're looking at. If you come up with an answer, I would like to know. Everyone would like to know. So, but I hope that answers your question.
Other questions?
Hi, I wanted to say thank you, and also I was wondering, like, penguins are great, but like, why did you personally pick penguins as your endeavor?
Sure, I'm going to be completely honest with you. They were my favorite animal forever. As a little kid, I loved penguins. We have that one special animal. And I started as I was doing my studies in high school. I had to do a lot of projects, and I had to do a lot of science projects, and I kind of fell in love with science. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go into science. So I went and did my undergraduate in science, and from there, what I learned in my undergraduate degree, I kind of realized I could apply to penguins. So penguins, I could go on for hours about penguins, but they're a species that are a group of animals that adapt to everything. Their adaptations are huge. And a lot of people don't realize, but there are 18 species of them. And all those species are different, but they're all considered penguins. And so they all have their different adaptations in that way. So from a scientific standpoint, the more I got into science, the more I also got into penguins. So it kind of grew at the same rate, essentially. And so I knew that I wanted to kind of work more individually. So I wanted to do a lot of field work with them. That was my goal, was to work directly with them. Work with an individual colony or an individual species, so I got to know all about them. For many reasons, during my master's, I couldn't make that work. So I came up with an agroecology project, which actually turned out to be the best decision I could ever make. Because not only am I looking at all 18 species, but I know about all 18 species and what makes each of them special. And so I was able to kind of determine from there where I wanted to go with penguins. And penguins have half the battle won for them already, I like to say. penguins, people generally love penguins. So in that way, they already have a conservation focus. So I wanted to make sure that I could make sure that I learned about how to improve their conservation, essentially. So it kind of grew all different ways, but that was the main reason.
Hi. I was wondering how you found, like, specifically Lincoln or University of Lincoln. Is that the one that you went to
University
for
of
your
Lincoln,
master's program? How did you find that coming from the U.S.?
A lot of emails. That's where most of my luck, as I like to call it, comes from. So I finished my undergraduate degree, and I had applied to a bunch of graduate schools, and for funding reasons and other reasons, I didn't get in, nothing fit. So I really had no idea what I was going to do. And I was looking for jobs, looking for any way of getting into the field. And that included sending off emails to all and every penguin expert that I could. I sent off emails to really anyone who would read them or not read them. It was kind of blindly hoping someone would have a spot for me. For the University of Lincoln, I have family in England, and it was actually free to apply to graduate school. So I said, well, why not? You know, it would be great, but I wasn't expecting anything of it. I applied to 4 schools. I made a research proposal for what I wanted to do based on my penguin research. I was really not expecting much to come out of it. I was planning on maybe going into an oceanography field, kind of go that way. I got an email from my supervisor in England and said, I have connections here, and I could get you to go down and visit, and I could get you to do all this field work. Come on over. And I said, great, I'll be there next week. So that's how that happened. The same with South Africa. After I got my master's degree, I was looking for a job, looking about how I could get back into the field, because I wasn't sure, again, what I wanted to do, pursue a PhD or what I wanted to do. And again, I sent off emails to some of the same professors that I had sent them to. I said, okay, well, listen, I got my master's now. Does that change anything? Can I come still? I got responses. I got some response. I got nothing at all. I sent a lot of, hey, do you need help, free help in the field? Do you need an extra pair of hands to hold a penguin or anything? Anything to get me there in the field. And sure enough, I got an email from a professor down in South Africa who said, yeah, I have a research study. We go out there on this remote island with no running water every year. We study penguins straight for 3 weeks. Come on over. So that's how I ended up there. So it's kind of, don't give up. That's my biggest advice. Do not give up, I promise.
So are the IUCN areas owned by the IUCN or only designated as under their criteria?
That's a really, really good question. They are just designated as IUCN areas. So the actual country or area will apply almost to the IUCN, asking them to be considered a protected area. And they have booklets and pages of criteria that you have to meet in order to be designated as a IUCN protected area. And once you're designated, you get funding, essentially. So you'll get funding and you'll get the status of being IUCN. But the IUCN has no jurisdiction over those areas. So they will perform reviews of those areas. They will come out and make sure that you're meeting all of those different criteria. But there's no way that they actually manage them. Which puts in the other problem that are they actually being managed as they're said to be managed? Are we actually going about it and not just designating them and then not doing anything with them? But yeah, so IUCN is just an international body. It has no law or no rule over these areas, just the country that they're in.
Kind of actually to a follow-up as that question, do you know how an animal, I don't know if nominated is the right word, how an animal can get nominated to get evaluated by the IUCN?
So how does that happen? Or there's a lot of different ways to go about that. I do know that there has to be significant studies on those animals. They can't just go out and just pick a species. There has to be data to back it up, and there has to be a reason for them to go out there. It also has to be feasible for them to be able to go and look at these different species and evaluate them. A lot of it is done using scientific data. So they will look at all the data from different studies. Even if it seems irrelevant, studying the species, they will take into consideration. And they will look at, they have a variety of different things that they must meet. So there are, if you go to the IUCN website, they have all the species that are actually have been evaluated, and there are a lot of them that say not enough data is present, or not enough known at this time, or unable to evaluate. They are always adding to that list, and they're always updating that list. But there are, there's a species of some sort of reptile species that only live in this certain area that no one's studied yet. There's no way for them to figure out how it should be protected. So again, that's an area where we need to improve, and hopefully, as we discover more species, we can also get more data on them, which is why it's hugely important to look at every species and figure out, how can we contribute to the overall data that we have for this species. Because all that data contributes to the IUCN in determining whether it is protected or not.
Would you mind if I add something to that? So, Species Survival Commission of the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, so it has specialist groups. And so those specialist groups look at each of the taxa within those groups, and they may say that it's data deficient. They just don't have enough information to decide where it might fit. Each of those criteria you saw earlier have very specific things attached to them. And so the data is analyzed and looked at and gone, okay, it really seems to fit within this. So it's looking at things not only related to population size, geographic distribution, but also threats. Whether those are threats that are right now, but in some cases looking towards future threats as well. Other questions? I have a question. I would like to, first of all, I hope everybody in here recognizes that GIS is an extraordinarily powerful tool in looking at problems. And so one of the things is you've got lots of different data layers that you were looking at. Do you know if any of the penguins have actually been looked at for climate change vulnerability analysis?
Yeah, and we're constantly adding to that. Penguins are unique in that there are specialists that work with a specific species. And we have compiled a lot of that to look at vulnerability in terms of climate change. And right now, there are species that they're focusing on based on that. One thing that I would like to say is penguins are hugely dependent on cold water. So if you look at the map of penguins and then if you overlay it actually with the cold currents, they follow those cold currents, which is why they haven't made it across the Galapagos, because the current stops there. So they're looking at things like climate change and changing those water temperatures and looking at what species are more vulnerable. And there's ongoing studies that are looking at that, yeah.
On top of that, fisheries, global fisheries are a real problem, and we're seeing the collapse of fisheries around the world. And clearly, when you've got species that are dependent upon oceanic resources, and you've got humans that are also attacking those resources rather energetically. Do you know of any modeling that's looking at major threats from fisheries and how that might be addressed on a global scale?
Yeah, actually, in South Africa, there are huge studies going on, and actually I helped with one of them. So what they were doing in South Africa is we were doing kind of two things. We would look at penguins coming back to the colony, and we'd look at what they had in their stomachs for fish to determine if they were eating what we thought they were eating, how much they were eating, whether they were going out, coming back empty. We were also attaching satellites to their backs. Those were just GPS satellites. We would attach them. They'd go out and they would swim, and we would find where they were going to swim. We had data over years and years of their expected patterns of foraging, and actually for African penguins and a lot of other species that they've been doing this work with, they're going a lot farther to get fish. So while the fisheries, there is what's called a sardine run in South Africa, off the coast of South Africa. And while it's still present, there are a lot of whales and seabirds and the Cape fur seals. There's tons of different organisms that are using those sardine runs. So penguins are having to go farther off the coast, which means they're away from the colony more, which means they're away from their chicks longer. So when they come back, they're not having as much as fish in their stomach as we thought. They'd only have a couple fish sometimes in their stomach to feed their chicks. They were away longer, so their chicks were sometimes not surviving that length of time. And then they were also, because of that extended period of time that they were having to be out foraging for their fish, it would run into their molting season. So they'd have to abandon their chicks early in order to molt, because they can't reproduce if they don't survive. So that's just one example of how we're looking at it from a African penguin point of view. But I know that they're doing that with other banded penguins in South Africa. In South America, they're looking at, and for most of the species, we are finding that they are traveling further because there is less fish available. We are seeing, I thought this was really fascinating what I learned. Cape fur seals, which are kind of sea lions off the coast, they are not inherently a competitor of penguins. So they don't go out looking for penguins to eat. They're looking for fish to eat. We're seeing, talking firsthand with some rehabilitators and some of the researchers out there, they're seeing more Cape fur seal related injuries to penguins than they have in the past. This is because the Cape fur seals are going after the penguins, they're biting their stomachs so they get the fish in the penguin's stomach, and then they leave the penguin to die. So they're not going after the penguin, they don't want the penguin, they want the fish. So that's another reason, that's another thing that we're seeing. And so all these little stories are building up to show that these fisheries are collapsing, and the different types of fish that we're seeing in a penguin's stomach rather than what they used to eat is also changing. So we are seeing that across the majority of penguin species.
Any other questions? Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming to see us today.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming tonight.